This is, for example, a podcast exploring perspectives of the global Cold War, brought to you by the graduate students of the History and Political Science departments of Texas State University and the staff at Alcac Library. This podcast is funded by a Humanities Texas grant.
I'm going to give us a brief introduction, introduce each of us, introduce why we're here, what is the purpose of being here, and we'll just hit the ground running from there.
All right.
Sounds good.
There we go. All right, I'll just start us up. All right, thank you, Dr. Doyle, for being here today. We are here to discuss your book, Nuclear Ethics in the 21st Century, Survival, Order, and Justice. It's a privilege to have you here, and
Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert, for being here as well. If you want to give a brief introduction of yourselves.
Hi, my name is Gilbert. I'm a graduate student in the History department, and I'm taking a Cold War seminar with Aaron here. And Aaron's emphasis in the seminar has been nuclear weapons and disarmament or non-proliferation, and it grabbed my attention, and he asked me to be his colleague here in this interview. So I'm here just to support him and Professor Doyle in this talk.
I'm Aaron Holland, a graduate student here at Texas State, also in the Global Cold War seminar with Gilbert here, and also writing a thesis with Dr. Doyle, so it's a privilege and an honor to have him here. And Dr. Doyle is an associate professor here at Texas State. If you want to give a little introduction of yourself, if you want.
So, associate professor in the political science department. My PhD's from the University of California at Irvine. My publications span two fields in international security studies. First is just the politics and whatnot of nuclear weapons. Some of that involves trying to understand security strategy with nuclear weapons, how nuclear deterrence might function, what possible scenarios of nuclear conflict might look like, as well as trying to grapple with the ways states manage the expansion of nuclear weapons in the world, so-called nuclear arms control policy, non-proliferation, even ranging into issues of disarmament. I also write on matters of normativity, which leads to this interdisciplinary focus on nuclear ethics. So nuclear ethics isn't just trying to understand the politics and possible military use of nuclear weapons from a moral standpoint. It's also trying to grapple it through the lens of international law. And since international law can oftentimes be understood as the formal expression of ethical values, then it's important to understand what international law has to say about nuclear weapons, regulating them, prohibiting them, so on and so forth. So that's what I write on, and generally I teach international security and conflict courses for the department, as well as courses in issues in world politics. I do have an MA seminar that I offer every couple of years or so on the politics and history of nuclear weapons. And occasionally I throw in some material on my research area of nuclear ethics.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Doyle. And so basically the goal of this podcast here is to uncover what the role and influence some of the nuclear deterrence policies during the Cold War era between the Soviet Union and the United States have had on influencing some of the third world countries that we can decipher as being developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we're curious as to how the Cold War was not just a bipolar issue, but also a global issue that affected various countries amongst the world, being the third world countries, and what we consider the first and second world countries, and the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. So this is a global Cold War podcast, and so we're just going to dive right in with questions.
Sure.
So what role and impact did the nuclear deterrent policies of the Soviet Union and the United States have on influencing the perceived third world countries, those being the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, with what research you've uncovered?
I suppose a short answer to that question would be that nuclear deterrence was a solution to a problem that arose after the end of World War II, when, as the surrender documents were being submitted by Germany, as we began to see the extent to which Soviet armies had begun to occupy certain portions of Eastern Europe, and as the United States began to realize that it was outnumbered by the former Soviet Union in terms of numbers of personnel on the ground, that the United States economy might not be able to support an indefinite posture of military bases throughout Europe to try and have parity with the Soviet Union in terms of numbers of troops. So the commitment to nuclear deterrence by the Eisenhower administration fundamentally was a solution to that problem. And the idea was that our nuclear arsenal was fundamentally about threatening the Russians with retaliation if they were to invade West Berlin, West Germany, or any of the other NATO allies. The Soviets responded in kind. And for a significant portion of the early Cold War, the United States maintained either nuclear monopoly or nuclear superiority. So, for example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, if memory serves me correctly, for every one nuclear weapon the Soviet Union had, the United States had at least 10, maybe 20. And so with that kind of nuclear superiority, it was it was more straightforward in terms of restraining Russian emboldenment. The one way of thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis was that as the Soviets are increasing the size of their nuclear arsenal, they seem to develop the idea that they could use those weapons to twist arms. So we might call that nuclear blackmail. And when the United States found that the Soviets were putting nuclear missiles in Cuba, that became a moment of President Kennedy drawing this invisible line in the Atlantic Ocean. And the idea was that if that resupply of nuclear weapons was going to continue, that the United States was going to consider that as a full-fledged attack on the United States, deserving of a nuclear response. And we know the history that through the diplomacy that President Kennedy and Soviet leader Khrushchev engaged in, the Russians backed down. And then we begin a period of nuclear arms control in earnest. But that didn't mean deterrence went away. So both sides are threatening to use nuclear weapons on the other side if certain red lines are crossed. So deterrence is really fundamentally a superpower dynamic. Now, your question also brought in the developing world, and it just, with nuclear weapons as kinds of weapons of mass destruction they are, there's really no way for the two superpowers to threaten each other without it having a certain amount of spillover effect into the developing world. I mean, so obviously Cuba is a part of that.
Yep.
But you can also see much of the rest of the world figuring out that if the superpowers ever began to use these weapons on each other, that they were going to experience the spillover effects. And you can think of at least two different kinds of spillover effects. So if the United States and Soviet Union have a nuclear war in Europe, or they have a nuclear war close to Korea, close to Japan, close to Vietnam, then one spillover effect is just the way the weather patterns and the wind is going to take radioactive fallout and spread it wherever the wind goes. But it also could be the case, especially since the United States has military bases all over the world, that if part of the Russian attack is to hit US military assets, then you could see that some of these overseas assets might be targets of nuclear attack. For example, the US military base in Guam, or US military bases in Japan. So this could actually turn out to be a worldwide kind of thing, especially if you've got nuclear weapons being launched from different kinds of platforms. I mean, we talk about the nuclear triad, and the nuclear triad is really a term that refers to three different platforms from which nuclear weapons could be used. So the first platform historically would be the US Air Force or any other country's Air Force that would be carrying nuclear armed bombs that would be dropped from planes. We know that that's the way the atomic bombs were delivered to Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But then there's also the land-based missiles. And so these could either be short range, intermediate range, or very long range, traveling between the US continent and Russia, or vice versa. So you have this land-based component, and then you have a sea-based component. Submarines with nuclear armed missiles launching from wherever they happen to be and whatever water body they happen to be patrolling in. So there's three vectors from which nuclear weapons could be launched and used, and they have worldwide reach, and depending upon how far away any particular target is from the weapon that is being aiming at that target, you could be looking at a time span anywhere between 10 to 35 minutes between launch and detonation. So those are the kinds of time parameters we're looking at, and that gives us a little bit more concrete detail on what some of the spillover effects would be for third-party countries, especially developing countries.
So it's safe to say that spillover effect causes nuclear deterrent policies of these superpowers to very much affect the developing world and third world countries and countries in general that have maybe nothing to do with the nuclear weapon states and their issues that be, amongst each other.
Yes, I think that's part of the reason why it's not surprising that a lot of the advocacy for nuclear disarmament comes from the developing world. They're hoping that they can escape the poverty that they've been dealing with for so long, and to have the threat of nuclear fallout or the threat of nuclear war,
Timed out.
your thing timed out.
But it's still recording, right, Aaron?
I think it's still recording, yeah.
So going back to Aaron's point about how it affected the third world. So that those third world countries are what you refer to as the New Agenda Coalition, not you, but specifically that would be the New Agenda Coalition?
Not all
Okay.
third world countries are part of the New Agenda Coalition, and some New Agenda Coalition states are developed countries. The New Agenda Coalition originally formed in the late 1990s as a result of, so this is a little bit of a long story. So every 5 years, the states parties that belong to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, they meet to have a review conference. And the purpose to have the review conference is to take stock of what they've done in the previous 5 years that leads to progress on the various missions that the treaty has set out. So the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, otherwise known as the NPT, has 3 missions. First is non-proliferation, so no more spreading of nuclear weapons to non-nuclear weapon states. Second is facilitating access to peaceful nuclear energy. And the third mission is the disarmament mission. The idea being is that when the NPT was first came into effect in 1970, you had 5 declared nuclear weapon states already, and there wasn't any way that they were going to get rid of their nuclear weapons. So at that time, so these 5 states are part of the NPT as nuclear weapon states. That's the legal term in the treaty for these 5 countries.
And sorry, Professor Doyle, but these would be the USA, Russia, England, France, and China?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, every other state that belongs to the NPT is a non-nuclear weapon state. There's only 5 countries in the world now that are not a part of the NPT. That's India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, and South Sudan. With the exception of South Sudan, all of those countries that are not a part of the NPT have nuclear weapons. So if one thinks about the NPT as an arms control regime that is now 52 years old, we can say that for the most part, the NPT has succeeded in its non-proliferation mission. It doesn't have an A+, but we could say it probably deserves an A-. And one of the reasons for that is that every state in the NPT seems to be firmly committed to the non-proliferation mission, although there's some worry about a couple of states like Iran, Syria. Used to be we were worried about Iraq. And every now and then we begin to wonder about other more reputable countries, for the lack of a better word. We sometimes wonder about Japan, but we wonder about Japan because they're in the immediate neighborhood of hostile nuclear armed states like North Korea. So we wonder, is there a point at which Japan would acquire nuclear weapons? We also worry about South Korea every now and then. We worry about Germany. We worry about maybe 10 to 15 countries. We're also worried about what happens if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. Will that provoke Saudi Arabia? Will that provoke Jordan? But so far, there has not seemed to be any serious movement by the non-nuclear weapon states to acquire nuclear weapons, with perhaps the exception of Iran. All right, so A- to non-proliferation. I'd say A- to the nuclear energy mission. The disarmament mission has not made progress. And that's where the New Agenda Coalition comes in. So on the 25th birthday of the NPT, the review conference was the first review conference after the end of the Cold War. And the treaty was set to expire. So the United States and some other countries were motivated to put on the agenda a proposition that the NPT would be renewed. And not just for another 5 years, but indefinitely. The non-nuclear weapon states were torn because, on the one hand, it's in their interest to see non-proliferation continue to succeed, but it's not in their interest, or at least in many non-nuclear weapon states' interest, for the nuclear weapon states to keep their nuclear weapons. The idea is that every country at some point would be rid of them entirely. So in 1995, as a condition for renewing the NPT indefinitely, the United States and at least every nuclear weapon state that signed that final document agreed to renew the promise of nuclear disarmament as the treaty expresses it in Article 6. 1997-98 comes around, and key non-nuclear weapon states are observing that the nuclear weapon states haven't lifted a finger yet to try and get something done, which isn't exactly true, because the first thing that was the signal of serious intent to disarm was to promote another treaty called the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That treaty goes by the initial CTBT, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. President Clinton was the first world leader to sign it. And that treaty says that it'll come into effect once a certain set of countries ratifies that treaty. So it's not just a certain threshold of ratifications, it's that certain states must ratify it, like China, like Russia, like the United States. The United States didn't ratify it because after President Clinton signed it, the treaty, of course, goes to the Senate for advice and consent, right? They must consent to the treaty. The Republican Senate did not. So the United States did not join the CTBT, and the CTBT and several other states haven't either. So the CTBT never got put into effect. This was really worrisome to the nuclear weapon states that were really pushing for nuclear disarmament. So out of that anxiety, you get the New Agenda Coalition, composed of states like Mexico, South Africa, New Zealand, and a few others that are slipping my memory right now. But you can tell just from that simple list that I've given you that this is a mixture of countries, some of which would arguably could be considered developed.
And if I may interrupt. They were Brazil, Egypt, Ireland, Mexico, New Zealand, Slovenia, South Africa, and Sweden.
Thank you.
These were the new agenda coalitions.
Thank you. So if you think about Brazil, for example, Brazil and Mexico, or Ireland, Slovenia. Now Slovenia since then has pulled out. Sweden was in at the origin. Sweden has since pulled out of the New Agenda Coalition. But at its uptick, the New Agenda Coalition was geographically diverse, ethnically diverse, linguistically diverse, and diverse in terms of economic status. And each of these countries was motivated to intensify their diplomacy with the nuclear weapon states, to get them to really commit to nuclear disarmament. So 5 years later, in the year 2000, they lobbied the nuclear weapon states to commit to a series of 13 steps. And that was the way they tried to put some concrete finish on what Article 6 required for disarmament. So the first of the steps was the CTBT. Another step was the creation of another treaty that was supposed to control fissile materials, which are the materials that make a nuclear weapon a nuclear weapon.
So also, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
But so step 6 has listed as the NAC says unequivocal undertaking by the nuclear weapon states to accomplish the total elimination of their nuclear arsenals leading to nuclear disarmament, to which all state parties are committed under Article 6.
Yes, so I mean, this is in a way, the 6th step doesn't add content, it adds emphasis. It's kind of like saying to somebody, so you really want to get married, okay? Let's do it. And then say, well, okay, I just said something different than what I originally said. Not really, but the 6th step is a step to raise awareness of how critical of an issue this is for the New Agenda Coalition. Now, another thing to realize about the New Agenda Coalition is that many of these states are the leaders in their regions, and Latin America has had a nuclear weapon free zone treaty since the late 1960s. Africa, it has a nuclear weapons free zone. The area around New Zealand has a nuclear weapons free zone. So we're talking about states that are spokespersons for the regions that they're inhabiting. And so in a way, I think the New Agenda Coalition saw themselves as not just speaking for themselves, but speaking for a much broader audience.
And do you think, Professor Doyle, this is because of the spillover effects of a nuclear confrontation?
Well, it's part of it, certainly part of it. I mean, if you think about where much of the nuclear testing was done, the United States did a lot of nuclear testing on the indigenous reservation lands in New Mexico and in California and but also in the South Pacific.
Extensively in the Marshall Islands.
Marshall Islands was one area. France did a lot of nuclear testing in the South Pacific. Nuclear weapon states have not wanted to necessarily test in their own backyard. So they want to go find places that they don't think are going to be a problem. Of course, much of the nuclear testing regime first started with above ground tests, then tests in the high atmosphere. By the mid-1960s, we were beginning to ban areas of our environment in which nuclear testing took place. Eventually, we banned atmospheric testing. Then we banned testing in the oceans. And that meant that the only place left to test was underground. And so most of the nuclear tests that took place in the 1980s through the 1990s, and then with North Korea since 2006, have all been underground tests. The United States hasn't tested nuclear weapons since 1992. So, while the United States has not ratified the CTBT, we've adhered to the norm prohibiting nuclear testing.
Can I interject? Is there anything restricting the U.S. from not practicing that norm, considering we're not signed on to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty?
Well, I think some of it might just be reputational.
Being the moral leader, in other words?
Yeah.
Example saying, hey,
yeah. I mean, ostensibly, the United States wants to reduce the profile of nuclear weapons in our security strategy, and if we keep on testing nuclear weapons, then we're not doing that.
Yep.
But it also, in a way, is sort of the surreptitious way to get nuclear disarmament. If you stop testing, then maybe it might be that you don't have any confidence that the weapons would be effective if they were ever used in battle. And so this might be, in some person's mind, a way to kind of back into nuclear disarmament without going through the more anxious process of saying we're eliminating weapons, because one of the big fears of the nuclear weapon states is, how do we verify that a country's actually eliminated all their nuclear weapons? It could be that they cheat. So if the American fear is Russia's going to cheat, China's going to cheat, they will set it up to where it looks like they've gotten rid of all their nuclear weapons, but in some garage somewhere that nobody has been able to detect, they've got a hidden arsenal. Then, at a moment in which we're surprised, they hit us with nuclear weapons and we can't hit back. That's the fear that prevents the nuclear weapon states from fully committing to a disarmament agenda.
And so I guess talking about how we would verify if these states or non-nuclear states, what type of organization, like would NATO be an organization that nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states could have faith in verifying, or like the
No, it would be an independent organization, and the CTBT has already set up that organization. It's called the CTBTO. And one of the most important contributions that organization has enabled is a worldwide monitoring system that detects seismic activity and is able to pinpoint where that ground shaking has taken place. So obviously some earthquakes are not produced by nuclear weapons. Most earthquakes are not produced by nuclear weapons. But when you have an underground nuclear test, it can read like an earthquake. So if you have a really good knowledge of the seismic, activity in areas, and where are the tectonic plates, where they meet, what's the history of earthquakes in that particular region. You get the idea that we are confident, let's say, maybe not 100%, but to, let's say 90-95% degree confidence that a nuclear weapon was tested in this area, because we wouldn't be expecting seismic activity of that kind naturally. And you might even be able to estimate, well, what was the explosive yield of that device that was tested? And that's how we've begun to figure out, at what stage is North Korea in their development of nuclear weapons so far. Now, arguably, North Korea is a developing country, right? So you've got North Korea concentrating on building a nuclear deterrent that's reliable for them, fundamentally as a way to prevent any kind of regime change operation that the United States or United States with allies would attempt. And arguably Pakistan is a developing country, and they have a nuclear arsenal that's trying to deter India. Wherever a world economist would place India on the developing versus developed continuum, they have a nuclear arsenal whose primary focus is China and Pakistan. Israel's nuclear arsenal for the longest time has been trying to deter Arab aggression, but the Middle East political environment is really changing, and it's difficult to say that Arab has any stalwart Arab enemies. They have a stalwart enemy in Iran, but it's amazing how much rapport now Israel has with countries like Saudi Arabia. So I don't know where Israel is going to land on all that. They'll probably maintain a nuclear arsenal along with their deliberate ambiguity policy of neither confirming nor denying officially that they have nuclear weapons. But I think their main focus is Iran and will be.
Could you, why would Israel want to have that policy of ambiguity, of not stating whether they have nuclear weapons or they do not have nuclear weapons? Why would a state, I guess, kind of expand on that kind of thinking?
Why wouldn't they show off?
Is it strategic thinking on Israel's part? I mean, I'm sure it's strategic thinking, but I guess I'm just trying to understand, why, look, we have nuclear weapons, don't mess with us, or we don't have nuclear weapons, blah, blah, blah. I mean,
Yeah, so a very interesting book has been written on this subject by Avner Cohen. The title of this book is called The Worst Kept Secret. Now, the origin of this policy of nuclear ambiguity by Israel was way back in the climate of the Arab-Israeli wars of the 60s and 70s. And the idea was that if Israel came out as a nuclear weapon state the way, let's say, China did in 1964 or France did in 1960, then it would provoke the Arab states to get nuclear weapons as well. And that would not be in Israel's interest for them to be surrounded by nuclear armed powers. On the other hand, they didn't feel that they could get away with not having nuclear weapons, given the fact that they were attacked twice by Arab countries, 67 and 73, And the 73 war didn't go as well as the 67 war. And so they could imagine needing nuclear deterrence because they were surrounded and outmanned. So in a way, it's like the Israeli nuclear deterrence had a similar sort of issue that the United States did. You know, if you're outmanned and outgunned, you need to compensate for that. And there's nothing like nuclear deterrence to compensate. It equalizes a playing field. So they've maintained this policy of nuclear ambiguity. The reason why Avner Cohen calls it the worst kept secret is because there have been on occasion official statements by Israeli politicians in the Knesset or otherwise that yes, they actually have a nuclear arsenal. But then, you know, there's denials that follow that, and that's how they at least maintain the appearance of ambiguity. Cohen wrote in the book that if there's ever a hope for the Middle East to be a nuclear weapon-free zone, Israel would need to abandon its ambiguity on its nuclear posture, declare itself a nuclear power, and then disarm. It's extremely important in the United Nations General Assembly that the Middle East become a nuclear weapon-free zone because of how volatile the region is.
Also vital.
Vital and volatile.
Yeah.
So for it to be a nuclear weapons-free zone would reduce a lot of international anxiety about the risk of nuclear conflict taking place and then spreading.
Can I ask a question that plays on that? This is maybe a difficult question for you to ask, kind of a objective question or answer that you could probably give, but to what advice would you give the head of state of a country that is not nuclear but is tired of living in like a nuclear dominated society, especially one that dictates a first class society of but nuclear weapon states compared to a second class of society that is non-nuclear weapon states? You know, how could the head of state of a second class state develop this idea of a social community to the degree of a common security and society that you kind of describe in this book? You know, in what way could a head of state of Myanmar, or maybe the head of state of, let's say, Azerbaijan, influence the development of a common security environment to develop among societies?
Okay, so it matters which country takes the lead or which set of countries take the lead. Because I'm not entirely sure that Azerbaijan or Bangladesh, if they have non-nuclear aspirations, if they're one of the states that have signed on to the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, I'm not sure they have the political leverage. You need to have countries that the nuclear weapon states will pay attention to. And that means you're going to need to have some countries that are able to influence the behaviors of the nuclear weapon states. Now, the nuclear weapon states, of course, are rivals of each other. I mean, we might say that generally the rivalry is, you have a pair of rivalries. The rivalry between the United States and Russia, then the rivalry between the United States and China. And sometimes that rivalry gets to where Russia and China on some issues seem to be on the same side. England and France typically are on the US side of things, but not always France. And sometimes not always Britain. but most of the time Britain and the United States are in lockstep. So these 5 countries have a very complicated dynamic. One major challenge is you need to have a country or a set of countries that can speak to all 5 and see what you can do to reduce their mutual anxieties. Now, that's a tall order. Probably it would be important for it to be a country with some economic clout.
So head of state of, say, like Australia, may have a little bit more clout in this situation than...
They're going to be perceived as too close to the US.
Okay.
And we see that happening in the change of the relationship between Australia and China already. Let's say we go back to the New Agenda Coalition. Does Mexico have the kind of clout that's necessary? I don't think so.
Maybe Mexico and Brazil.
Does Brazil have that kind of clout? I don't think so. And one of the things that makes Brazil problematic is it's just had a presidential term with Bolsonaro, who is ready to throw international agreements out the window in the same way that former President Trump was. Well, now we have a new Brazilian leader, Lula, kind of in the same vein as President Biden, although President Biden's more centrist than Lula is on the political spectrum. But at least it's like, okay, we're now back into the world of doing things through international organizations and respecting multilateral agreements and so on and so forth. But I don't know. I mean, Brazil has had a beating in the last 5 years. Mexico's suffered a lot in the last 5 years. What about New Zealand? Maybe, but it's still pretty small.
So it's safe to say reputation for these states plays a large role in whether they can impact the development of a social community that could potentially move us towards a disarmament movement.
Yes, and the United States has been quite active in its diplomacy to frustrate what they would believe would be an ill-advised and premature nuclear disarmament. So the United States has begun a series of diplomatic dialogues that's called Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament. CEND, Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament. And what they're trying to argue, and their target audience are European states that might be pulled into this nuclear disarmament movement, or any other state, maybe like Japan or South Korea or Australia.
Yep.
They want to emphasize that Ronald Reagan, former President Ronald Reagan, was right when he claimed we have nuclear weapons because we don't trust the other side. So the issue has to do with trust or distrust. If you have trust, then nuclear weapons seem to be less relevant, seem to be not necessary. Distrust fuels arms races. Mm-hmm. So, arguably, the United States and Russia have profound distrust, mutual distrust. Same thing with the United States and China. Until the CEND agenda assumes that unless these trust issues are resolved, then nuclear disarmament is premature. So disarmament has to be fitted to the environment, the threat environment. Otherwise, it's going to be counterproductive. It's going to blow up in our faces, so to speak. If we think of that as a belief or a posture that's coming from a particular perspective, and then we shift our perspective and let's say talk to Mexico or talk to Brazil or talk to New Zealand, they may say, yeah, we get it. And what's the chance that you guys are ever going to resolve your trust issues? If there's really no chance that you guys are going to resolve these trust issues, then what are New Zealanders supposed to do about it? Trust you to remain restrained? Trust you that this policy of mutual terror, policy of mutual threats, is going to lead everybody to remain restrained for the indefinite future? And you might get someone in one of these new agenda coalition countries to say, all it takes is for deterrence to fail in a major way one time, and everything is now potentially ruined. Whereas deterrence must have a perfect record from here until the end of the universe. And what are the odds of that?
It's a tall order.
It is. It's a very tall order. So from the perspective of new agenda coalition states, are now the states that have ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, they don't believe that resolution of trust issues or security dilemmas, that can't be the first thing on the docket. The first thing on the docket needs to be eliminating nuclear weapons, and then maybe fold into that process a way to resolve security dilemmas, but don't condition nuclear disarmament on the resolution of trust issues or security dilemmas. I think Americans and members of the British government, maybe French government, they may understand that logic intellectually, but viscerally, if you don't resolve the security dilemma and you disarm, then you're inviting the risk of cheating. You're inviting the risk of nuclear aggression later on. And that seems to be the conundrum that we're in.
So in that light, you have to embed the trust first amongst the adversaries and then seek disarmament rather than disarm and then seek to develop trust.
Well, that's certainly the logic behind the American position with the create the environment for nuclear disarmament, is that security dilemmas have to be resolved before you get rid of the nuclear weapons. And how do you do that? That's a matter of reducing distrust, then working to build trust, and in the process working to refashion the images of the relationship that we have with Russia, with China. If we're deeply convinced that we are mutual enemies and that that's not going to change, then that's going to pretty much keep the nuclear status quo in place. So, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed in the literature on nuclear disarmament is how much importance is placed on the historical case of President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev. And so we need to understand the possibilities and limits of that as a case study. So is it the case that President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev formed a personal friendship? Yes. Did they move at it step by step? Yes. Did they take leaps of faith towards each other? Yes. Did they make themselves vulnerable to each other? Yes. In ways that made their national security advisors on both sides quite nervous, by the way. Did it last? It lasted longer than you might think. I mean, President Reagan was termed out in 1988, and so then the next president, George H.W. Bush, took over. But because President Bush was the vice president during the Reagan years, that relationship could continue, right? When did that rapport between the Russians and the Americans begin to fade? During the Clinton administration. Because the Clinton administration was not brought into that relationship building. It wasn't necessarily their fault, of course. It's because Democrats weren't in power at the time. But did the Reagan administration reach out? Did the Bush administration reach out to try and bring Democrats in to the relationship building process? Not to my knowledge. So if they did it, then I don't know about it. But certainly that's one of the difficulties of having electoral democracies with term limits is your efforts, if they're succeeding in foreign policy, generally last only as long as the presidential administration that began them.
Sorry. So now that brings a question, Reagan and Gorbachev established this rapport, there has to be this belief in trust between leaders and nations right during the 1980s with Reagan and Gorbachev. But now let's take the situation of Iran and the US and Obama's treaty with Iran and is trying to establish a trust that the United States can be trusted in honoring its treaties, whereas when the Trump administration came to office, it, for lack of a better term, obliterated that trust, right? By pulling out of that comprehensive treaty of nuclear disarmament, blah, blah, blah. So I guess we can see, as you say, the limits of an electoral democracy. Right. So there's one administration that is trying to establish steps to, trust another nation or to increase trust between nations, whereas you'll have another administration come in and totally just say, you know what, we're not going to adhere to this for whatever reason. But in a short historical perspective, that's a step back, right, in comprehensive trust and in trying to get a comprehensive treaty to ban nuclear weapons or to limit their deployment or their
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So, and I just wanted to make that point because we're talking about the 80s, the 90s, and now the 2000s, and
Certainly.
2010. So
That was a great.
There's a historical perspective that hey, treaties can only last so long or policies only last so long. It's totally dependent on the administrations that come into power in a democratic country.
Yeah, in one sense, you get a little bit more continuity than volatility if you realize that presidents may come and go, but the bureaucracies of the State Department don't. And neither do the bureaucracies of some other agencies, and that probably is true for the foreign ministries of other countries. You have lifelong you have people who've spent their entire careers in the foreign ministry or in the State Department, whatnot. It's interesting to realize that as different as President Woodrow Wilson was from President Franklin Roosevelt, and as different as the fates of the League of Nations was from the fate of the United Nations. People who were working in the State Department for Woodrow Wilson were also working in the State Department for Franklin Roosevelt, and they both, this cadre of folks contributed both to the formation of the League and the formation of the UN. So there's that continuity, right? But it depends upon how far down the trust diffuses. So especially if the trust relationship begins up here at the level of the heads of state. You have Reagan, Gorbachev. All right.
I see.
So it's not just a matter of Reagan and Gorbachev forming a trust relationship. Reagan must convince all of his people that Gorbachev is trustworthy, and Gorbachev must convince all of his people that Reagan is trustworthy, and then they must see each other at this level down here as trustworthy partners, and then it has to diffuse down even more. Eventually, it needs to diffuse down to the level of the citizens of the countries, where if you were raised in the Cold War in the United States and taught that all Russians were godless commies, then that sets up an enemy image of what it, can we trust any Russian? Hell no. And if you're in, Moscow, can we trust any American? Hell no. All right. So how do we get down to where, I love the Russian people, or I love the American people. Why? Then we start taking off traits, you could say, well, Americans, do you love the Irish people? Yes, we do. Why? In fact, you can even ask Mexican people, do you love the Irish people? Absolutely. Vice versa, right? So do you have that relationship down here at the level of the people? If you do, it means there's been this broad diffusion, and because trust only up here is super fragile.
And time limited also.
It's time limited and it's fragile because it can always be undermined by somebody who's your subordinate or a subordinate of a subordinate. It's got to go all the way down in order for it to endure. But it's got to start somewhere. So I'm not saying that it's bad to start it at the level of the heads of state. It's just the heads of state need to think strategically. And if you're going to think strategically in terms of trust building, then you got to be able to see that it's got to diffuse. And returning to Aaron's question, well, what if you're the leader of a non-nuclear weapon state? That's the thing you've got to start inducing. You've got to start inducing this idea that the person who you think is your core enemy, actually, there's another way of thinking about them that's valid and aligns with your interests. And beginning to humanize the other, beginning to see how each of you've got interests in common, that's absolutely critical. And then doing the hard work of resolving uncertainties, resolving misunderstandings, resolving deep-seated prejudices. That's some awfully difficult work to do, but it's got to be done if you're going to create that kind of trust that makes possible their decision that we no longer need nuclear weapons.
So we're running out of time here. So to tie in the aspect of this, the purpose of this podcast, which is a global Cold War podcast, I'm going to wrap this interview with one last question, if you don't mind. To what degree do you believe the Cold War ever truly ended? There's great debate among historians about the idea that the Cold War ended when the Soviet Union collapsed. But there's also a number of historians that have argued the Cold War never truly ended, and many aspects of the Cold War that took place in the heightened peaks of the Cuban Missile Crisis to the heightened tensions right before Gorbachev and Reagan. A lot of those aspects between the U.S. and Russia are still kind of taking place today. For instance, the nuclear deterrent policies of the U.S. and Russia never really went away. They still rely on our nuclear deterrent policies, etc. So to what degree do you think, did the Cold War ever truly end? Is it still taking place? Or did it end when the Soviet Union collapsed, and today the events we're seeing are completely different and non-related to the Cold War?
I think the ideological Cold War between the former Soviet Union and the United States ended. That doesn't mean that there aren't other conflicts of interest that are provoking a different kind of Cold War. So I think just that we can, let's say, distinguish between different kinds of wars. I don't think anybody would say that the War of 1812 was just exactly like the American Revolutionary War, although there were features about both wars that were reminiscent of each other, right? If we are in a Cold War with Russia right now, it's not the Cold War of the 1940s through the early 1990s. It's a different one. If we're in a Cold War with China, same thing. It's not an ideological Cold War. It's more of a geopolitical contest than it is an ideological contest. I think part of the reason it's okay to say that is that China has a state capitalist model, and although the Communist Party maintains a monopoly of political power within China, it's not like they're trying to export communism. Now, they may be urging countries that are interested in Belt and Road participation to not play the liberal international order game in the way the United States wants everybody to play it. But that's not the same thing as exporting communism. And Russia's not exporting communism, even though Putin was a KGB agent. But I mean, he has this vision of a Russia that's more in the Russian Orthodox mold. Russia as a God-chosen country, which is nothing you'd ever hear Brezhnev say or Stalin. I mean, that would not have been the party line back in those days. So there are some features that are reminiscent of the old Cold War, but it's not the same Cold War.
Real quick before we end, Professor Doyle, how did you get interested in the subject that you are writing about? When you say you graduated from the University of Irvine, what influenced you to pick this topic or this theme?
Well, I've had a lifelong interest in the Cold War nuclear dilemma. I had that interest when I was in high school,
okay,
and when I was an undergraduate. I had been thinking for quite some time about the moral issues of using nuclear weapons. And so I was in a research seminar with the professor that was going to be my dissertation advisor. And so I wrote this paper on nuclear ethics for the research seminar. And she encouraged me to pick it up because the nuclear ethics literature had, in her view, gone dormant. And she thought there was something new to be said and that I could figure out what that was. So I took her suggestion and ran with it. And
you're here today.
Here it is.
Okay. Yeah, I'm always interested in just how people get into their fields or their areas of interest is very important. And I think encouragement from professors is really important because they are the ones that encourage their students to, hey, how about exploring an aspect of whatever theme or thread in history that has been understudied or is looked over.
Absolutely. That's why we're here today. Dr. Doyle is really the reason I'm in nuclear weapons. So,
Good.
absolutely. Well, I appreciate you being here, Dr. Doyle. Appreciate you being here, Gilbert. If anybody's interested in learning more about this aspect, check out Dr. Doyle's book, Nuclear Ethics in the 21st Century, Survival, Order, and Justice. He discusses all these ideas in much greater detail than we've been able to do today, but it's an absolutely fantastic read. Go check it out if you're interested. And this is the Global World War Podcast, and thank you for checking us out.
thank you.
Thank you, everybody.